data science with on-the-ground political intel and partnerships to identify really important state and local elections or policy opportunities where we can get involved to make an outsized impact on moving the needle forward on tackling climate change and all the related issues. So the reason that we focus on state and local elections and state and local policy is because it's really easy to get caught up on who's in the White House and who's in Congress, but we know that we actually can't address climate change or create food sovereignty or build more resilient communities without leadership at every level of government, especially the local levels. So actually, there's a study by Bloomberg Philanthropies that shows that 75% of our emissions in the US, or 75% of progress to our emissions goals in the US can be achieved through state and local government action alone. And when it comes to food access and food justice, we know that local levels of government have even more direct control. But the problem is there are a lot of local offices, and we need to build political power to have to really make sure that we're winning and moving the needle forward on these issues. So the best thing, of course, is to focus on your own community and your own elected officials. As a national organization, Climate Cabinet works to track these opportunities across the country at scale and get involved in places where we as an organization can make the biggest impact. So we're really focused on coordinated state and local political power across the US, because we know that this is how our opposition works, is really investing not just in the White House and in Congress, but across the country. So just a little bit more of our track record, and then we'll get into the topic. We got our start in 2018 as a volunteer-based team helping candidates running for office build stronger climate platforms. And they all wanted the same information. They wanted to know, how is this issue impacting my community? How are the solutions to climate change, like clean energy jobs and investments to support farmers, tangibly benefiting regular everyday Americans across the country? So we started pulling together a team of data scientists to help us get that specific information for all the candidates we were working with, no matter where they are. And that's how our work became data informed and place-based at scale. So now we have 14 people on the team across 8 states in the country doing on-the-ground work, mostly in battleground states: Arizona, Minnesota, Michigan, Virginia, Pennsylvania. But we've also gotten involved here in Illinois. Markia and I are both here in the Chicago area, and we're really excited to be here today talking about building political power for food and climate justice. So I'll pause there. Markia, could you introduce yourself and then we'll get into it?
Yeah. Hi, everyone. My name is Markia Thomas. I use she, her pronouns. I am in a southwest suburb of Chicago, and I am Climate Cabinet's communications director. I always say my biggest passion is really to change the hearts and minds of people. And I've been working in climate for a decade or so. And it's like one of the places where it seems like such an abstract topic. And so through conversations like these, through some of the work that we do with Climate Cabinet, through working with elected officials, my goal is to really help people see how climate impacts our day-to-day here and now, because largely it is something that happens over space and time, which means that it's very easy to miss, although fossil fuels are directly behind a lot of our day-to-day issues that we see. So yeah, happy to be here, and I am ready to jump in this. Thank you, Emma, for telling us who Climate Cabinet is. But I do have a follow-up question for you. And my question is, so what is Climate Cabinet doing? What states are we working in? And what are our goals?
Definitely. Yeah, I just jumped right into it before. So Climate Cabinet right now for 2024, obviously huge election year. That's probably on a lot of our minds. We're focused across the country on building political power for state and local climate leadership in places where we can really be a catalyst to create big change. So that means right now, some of our top priority states for electoral work are Arizona and Pennsylvania, places where we're 1 or 2 seats away in the state legislature from winning a pro-climate trifecta government, which could, take the state from having climate denial leadership, killing every piece of progressive legislation that comes before them, to suddenly being able to pass 100% clean electricity legislation, suddenly being able to invest in if the state chose to create a budget priority that was supporting local food access initiatives, the world of possibility would open up. We're also involved this year in Minnesota and Michigan, which are two states that recently won pro-climate leadership with our support in 2022. And then in 2023, immediately passed a lot of the sweeping climate and progressive legislation. And so this year it's all about defending them. Those are a couple of our statewide goals for 2024. But beyond that, we're building out our local leaders program to be supporting elected officials who are leading local climate initiatives in their communities across the country. We're supporting advocates and candidates running for office to make sure everyone can be the strongest climate champion they can be. And we'd love to work with all of you on any campaigns that you're involved in or other questions you might have about how to support climate leadership on the campaign trail or in office. Awesome. Well, we're really, really excited to be here. So that's enough talking about climate cabinet big picture. I'm excited to get into the topic of today, focusing on building political power for climate and food justice specifically. So Markia, I would love to kick it off by asking you to share some background on the intersectional issues around food access that we're going to be talking about.
Yeah, thanks. This has been something that has been like a pet passion project of mine because I recently have gotten into like the idea of foraging. I don't know how to forage, but like I think it is a good skill that people once had and like it's gotten lost. So I just want to talk about how racism has continued to drive food insecurity in the US because it's a pretty interesting conversation. So there are like roughly 4 parts of this conversation, and it might fly by a little quickly, so I will slow down a bit. So part 1, no free foods on private lands. So it formally starts with the Emancipation Proclamation, where enslaved people were set free. And while enslaved, African people foraged and fished on the lands that they worked on, but after freedom, plantation owners said that Black people could no longer forage. So laws in the South began being passed where trespassing was a civil offense to a criminal offense, and it was specifically passed to keep Black and Indigenous people from eating on lands they don't own. But they don't own any land. So these laws that started off in the South soon began to grow and influence policy across the United States and then also became federal law. And I think this is an example of like how local and state leadership has the opportunity to really grow and influence national policy because it tends to get picked up by like neighboring states and then it grows from there. And this is an example of like the way it's worked in a bad way. And like, so our goal is to use these same tactics to be able to push for positive and better change. So that's part 1. Part 2, no free food on public lands. So another part of it is that Indigenous people managed the lands way before European people came, and Indigenous people formed mutually beneficial relationships with the land, water, and other mammals and animals. And when white people landed, they looked around and said, this doesn't look like the European farms that we're used to. So therefore, no one must be tending to the lands. And so they ravaged land so much, they destroyed everything that they took a step back and was like, so I think we need public parks. And so the way to get this land to go back to the way it used to when we got here, we're just going to do like a hands-off approach. And so that's how we got public parks and hands-off conservation. And they decided to use this method because they didn't believe that the lands were tended to because they weren't in the shape of European farms. And then so they told Indigenous people, hey, you can no longer use the lands in these public parks because these public parks are owned by the state and the federal government, and you don't own these lands. So therefore, you cannot use these lands for fooding, you cannot tend to them, and they're just going to become the things that they were before without realizing, without these mutually beneficial relationships, that's how we were able to keep up with such numbers of biodiversity because they use different tactics of like controlled burning, cleaning out lands, of like things that are like in the way of growing good fruits and vegetables, being able to maintain relationships with animals without having to tear down a bunch of trees. And they're just like, okay, we don't care about that. You all can't use this land for food either. So that's part 2. Part 3, classism. So roughly like 1950s, 1960s, grocery stores started popping up as a symbol of the middle class because only poor people gather their food. And so who wants to be poor? Poor people in this country are seen as like bad people, and it is something that people bring upon themselves. And if you dare gather your own food, that must mean that you are poor beyond belief. So grocery stores became a strategy and tactic to move people away from being able to gather their own food, because you want to keep up with the Joneses. And so people were like, okay, well, I don't want to be perceived as poor, so I'm going to go to these grocery stores and buy food formally. And this was like one of the last pushes that caused people to lean away from foraging and picking their own food and farming. And I think this is like why we see a lot of, I don't know if anybody's seen the TikTok, but there's a viral TikTok where Gen Z person was like, I didn't know you could pick lemons off of a tree. But the reason why people don't know that is because all of this generational knowledge that comes from foraging and farming is lost because we are pushing people into supermarkets and grocery stores. And then also, which comes into like part 4, making it illegal to be able to farm for your communities. We are seeing a huge fight over lack of funding for farming. Federal funding for farms tend to be for commercial farms. They do not fund communal farms. They do not see the value in people farming in order to sustain their own communities. So through privatizing seeds, through taxing people for having communal farms, a lot of these farms have essentially gone extinct and out of business. And people are trying to get back to that, but there are so many legal hurdles to jump through, which is another reason why local and state policy can help us return to the natural being of community, because humans are communal mammals, communal mammals. And throughout this quest for colonization, we have truly strayed away from the meaning and our whole purpose of life. There is like an example that I saw the other day too, that was like, if a monkey hoards bananas, people are like, we need to see what's going on that's keeping this monkey from like hoarding all the bananas, because you're supposed to share food. But like when it comes to like humans, hoarding bananas is totally acceptable because we tend to operate in self-preservation instead of communal preservation within the current societies and systems that we live in. So my finale, all these things have created a disconnect between people and their food, which allows for food to be privatized and only accessible to those with social and physical mobility. And then once you add in racist housing policies, you have a recipe for food deserts and the erasure of generational knowledge of how to independently nourish our bodies. And so my question for you all, and please drop it in the chat, does this resonate with anyone? And does anyone have any family or community history of how this impacts Illinois today? I do, but I want to hear from y'all first.
People also come off mute to share. If you want to drop it in the chat or raise your hand, come off mute, whatever folks are comfortable with.
I can give my example. So my family moved to this area from Mississippi during the Great Migration. My great-grandparents were sharecroppers. And when we first got to Chicago, my family lived downtown. But like there was such a fight over resources that they moved to like a south suburb, and where we established our roots. And developed a community, and like there was still, I guess, like farming practices, sorry, trying to get comfortable, farming practices and tactics that we use to be able to sustain our community. And we also were still very communal based. So like the survival of our 7-block, because our village is only 7 blocks long, our 7-block village was rooted in how are we going to have these communal farms? How are we going to do community gardening? How are we going to join together to feed one another, especially during the period of not just like the manufacturing boom, but then we have racist housing policies, we have the infiltration of crack cocaine, we have like the stealing of Black ideas to become like federal programs. So like free breakfast for students. The lottery was something that was actually created in Black neighborhoods. And so like battling things coming from each different way, my family was able to sustain each other regardless of how much money we had through our community and through feeding each other and nourishing each other. And that's one thing that still holds true today, is that one of the ways that we show each other we love each other is to make sure that we are well fed. And so now that I'm a mother and I am in my 30s and my elders are getting older, we have transitioned that power to like where it is my responsibility to cook and nourish and feed my elders as a way of saying thank you for showing up for us in that way. And now like my niece actually has a garden and a farm. So like we share our resources that way. And I'm very fortunate and grateful that we have been able to do so. But also I've seen the way it doesn't show up in other communities, and I think it's super important to do. And that's why I'm passionate about it. I'm sorry, we have a hand raised.
Yeah, my name is Annika. I'm currently living in Chicago, but I grew up in California and I went to college in Los Angeles. And for my thesis, I wrote about the South Central Farm, which was the largest community garden in the United States when it was around. It was located in South Central, which was an unprecedented location for such a large garden, especially given the redlining that has happened in Los Angeles. And it supported hundreds of local families with not only produce that compensated for their daily intake, but also medicinal crops and also like heritage crops. And it was a lot of South and Central American families who often were like who immigrated or who were undocumented using that land. So we do know that there's a lot of these sort of political aspects of access to food in a lot of these undernourished communities. And so they relied heavily on this urban public community garden to be able to supplement their nutrition. And the reason I bring that up is because that land has a very particular sort of private property history. It was owned by a landowner and, taken by the city during the Rodney King riots, and they wanted to give it back to the community through this community garden. And given, how we've been talking about the impact of private property and the impact of the government getting involved in land usage, in 2012, the Los Angeles City Council took back that land because it was now profitable beyond anything else we've seen in a while. And so they took back that land and sold it back to a private company, and they had to demolish the farm, and there was nothing that could be done about it. So it not personal in terms of my family getting involved, but personal in terms of like a lot of effort was put into researching this and learning about this story, and just wanted to share that with everyone.
Thank you for that fun fact. Rodney King is actually my cousin on my father's side. And part of the reason why we moved from Chicago to Sacramento was after the riots to help, again, communal, to help him spend the money. And I was a flower girl on his first wedding. So glad that you mentioned that, because I love telling that story. Anyone else? All right, so this is for you, Emma. Broad strokes. What power do various levels of state and local governments have over food policy and climate policy?
All right. Well, first of all, I think I just want to emphasize before getting into specific policies. I think like the background you just gave, Markia, on how it's all about like what's exciting about policy is that we can shape the kind of constraints of the world that we live in. And clearly, these policies, the ways that the government or cultural, social norms determines how we should and should not, or can and cannot access food, all have to do with who has power and how they're implementing it and how they're using their power to perpetuate the existing power structure along racial lines, along classes lines, and other examples that you gave. So I just wanted to start before getting into specific policy levers. We'll get back to power after that, because ultimately I think it's kind of unlimited. We can pass policy to do whatever we want to build the world that we want to build if we have the power to do so. But a couple examples of various levels or levers of policy options that state and local governments have. You can kind of think about it in a couple different ways. There's the federal government, what they can do, state governments, and then city and county local governments, and it gets even more local than that. The federal government, of course, we're all more familiar with, has lots of money. They can print money. They can create laws that set standards. Historically, we think of the federal government as creating funding for programs, but a lot of the federal programs that have been funded and that have been created, like Markia said, were actually piloted in the states or started in local communities. And so that's one reason that it's really important to focus on state and local governments, because we can create examples and precedents that then become the national model. At the state level, state governments have a big role in accessing federal funding that might be out there. Like right now, there's a lot of money on the table for community resilience projects, some grants for farmers, things like that. And state governments are kind of gatekeepers in making that easily accessible or not. They run programs, access services. State budgets are a really important process. Every year when states create their budgets, they're basically setting the priorities for what the state cares about and what they're going to put money into or not put money into. And, you know, that wonky document with all the dollars and cents is really just a statement about what we care about and how we're going to prioritize our resources. So that's a really important place that we can get involved. That can also include money that's allocated for cities and counties to implement local food projects or other things like that. And then at the city and county level, one thing that's important to think about is land use and zoning. I grew up in one of the western suburbs of Chicago, and I remember there was this whole fight when I was a kid about hoop houses, and like literally someone created a hoop house garden, like an enclosed garden in their backyard, and a neighbor reported it to the city because it wasn't in line with like the city code. And it became a whole debacle, and there was an argument about having chickens in the backyard. And that all comes down to local governments, how we can use land and how land is zoned and allocated for various purposes. And like Markia said earlier, there's a lot of precedent for banning the ability to use land in ways to produce your own food, or forage for your own food, and it doesn't have to be that way. And there's a lot of power that we can access at city and county levels to change that. At the city and county level, there's also things that we can do like pilot projects for community gardens or educational programs, which can then be really important for bringing people together in the community and setting examples for other levels of governments too. And there are programs like composting or donation programs. Some cities run programs that allow excess food waste that is still, or excess food, not waste, food that is still good to not go to waste. And I have some examples, but that's like an overview of some of the different levers that you could imagine different levels of government being able to exert over food policy. But kind of the limit is only our imagination. I can give a couple examples of some recent legislation that has passed in states and cities around the country. And then I'd love to hear from everyone here what types of policies or investments you would like to see. And then after that, we'll get into building power to make it happen. But thinking about different types of policy levers at different levels of government. There's standards. We can either require things like mandate certain types of behavior or action. We can ban certain types of behavior or action, change laws. That's what we can conventionally think of as laws. But then there's also policy levers around investments and incentives, which is basically, again, getting back to budgets and priorities. How is the state, city, or federal government spending money? That shows what we're prioritizing. And it can also align business or individual behavior with various outcomes by incentivizing certain courses of actions. And of course, we want to make sure we're incentivizing what is the best for people and sustainable. So an example of some recent action, Washington, D.C. in 2018 passed an ordinance banning restrictive covenants that would limit certain land use in areas where grocery stores could be built, because we know that grocery stores, there's often food deserts, and one of the reasons, among many complicated reasons, is grocery stores either buying up land or restricting access to competitors in the region. So Washington, D.C. is taking action to address at least some of the causes of that. Vermont a couple years ago banned disposal of food waste and yard debris in landfills, instead requiring commercial composting or forms of anaerobic digestion. New York State in 2020 tried to do something even better, requiring large generators of food scraps to donate excess food waste and compost remaining food scraps. I don't believe it passed, but that's an example of one state that's working to do something that would both address food insecurity and also reduce waste. What are some other standards that you can imagine? I'm imagining things like lifting bans on food production on public lands or requiring availability of healthy food in schools. What are some other standards that you could imagine or that you would want to support, whether at the city level or state level? I have some examples of investments and incentives too, but I'll just pause after these standards. Municipal composting, universal free school meals, totally. Okay, keep thinking of ideas. What is the level at which we can rein in HOAs? Oh, that is a great question. And I wish we'll keep thinking about that one. I think maybe there's something here around incentives and like aligning incentive structures to be putting the public interest in line with how we're creating incentives in society. A couple of states have created incentive programs or grant programs to support farmers that are using practices to reduce fossil fuel inputs, improve soil health, create cover crops, and things like that. You can also imagine incentivizing community programs to, like, we could fund community educational programs to help people understand how to grow their own food and incentivize that type of behavior in that way. What else do we have here? Cool. Does anyone want to come off of mute and talk about a policy idea that really inspires you or that is right now just a dream and that you'd like to turn into reality?
I guess I'd say there are pilot programs looking right now at like farm to food bank and ways to use federal funding at the state level to pay farmers for food that goes to the food bank. And the food bank is one food rescue system that we have, but we have a lot of other ones that fall outside of that. So being able to pay farmers for food that's maybe donated from a farmer's market to a local organization that's going to distribute it to their neighborhoods. And finding a way that we can have policy that no matter where the food is being donated, the farmers are getting paid for the food that they have grown.
That's awesome. I love that. Any other dreams or ideas or things you've seen? I like this idea in the chat about taking existing spaces like spurs and repurposing them for something that's a public good. Steph?
Hey everyone. Quick plug for a session tomorrow that is also answering this question. The Illinois Stewardship Alliance is doing a very similar session to this around building power at the state legislative level. And they're also organizing a Black Farmer and Grower Lobby Day. I believe it's April 6th, but they've got a really cool legislative agenda around building like more equity within our food system through reparations for those that were very wrong through how the food system was built. And unfortunately, I can't speak eloquently to any of the bills, but I can grab a one-pager if anybody's interested.
Oh, cool. Yeah, we should have mentioned that there's an Illinois specific session, I think tomorrow, which I hope to go to because that's really exciting to learn about the specific, more specifically policies here. Stuff. Cool. I know one thing I'm thinking about is I applied for a plot in a community garden just down the street. And I'm like, I'm really hoping I get it. I really want to be able to grow my own food, grow flowers and herbs and things like that. And I'm on a waiting list that I think is like years long. And it's just such a bummer that in this huge park, there's only this like small little area where we're allowed to grow food, and why it just feels so artificially constructed. And it's, I'd love to change the policies that govern society and be able to just build my own little garden plot in this huge area of public space. All right, cool. Well, I'd like to start shifting us away from policy and into power. Markia, can you share your thoughts on narrative power, what that is, and how we can use it to build power for food justice?
Yeah. So narrative power is a strategy for building power, regardless of what side you're on. It's something that dominates the conversations we have. So it's like formal definition. Narrative power is a type of power that uses storytelling to shape the norms and rules by which our societies live. And we use narrative power using counter narratives derived from the most marginalized individuals and communities to reimagine our existence and to expand the dimensions of what is considered normal and acceptable. Usually when I talk about narrative powers, I like to get a little specific because I always say all stories are narratives, but not all narratives are stories. And that is because narratives don't have a reason or a rhyme. They don't have a beginning, middle, or end. They are just things that we believe as to be true. I think one of the most widespread narratives that we tend to believe are like Black people are inherently criminal. There's nothing to suggest that. There's no evidence to back it. We don't know when it started. And it's still like an open-ended belief that people have. And examples of like stories that feed into that would be like how many Black people are incarcerated, how many stories in the news are told that target Black and brown people for crimes committed, and like stories around drug usage and what a person is supposed to look like that uses. And like, those are just ways to like separate the thinking. So when we're building narrative power, we want people to believe something innately. Like for me, one value I have is that humans are innately valuable. That doesn't have a beginning, middle, or end, but that's a narrative and a belief that I hold true. And food justice would be one of the stories that feed into that, because we all deserve the right to be able to nourish our bodies without punishment, just because we are human and we are here and we exist, and our role is to live in community amongst each other and with the earth. So that's like my brief version of like what narrative power is. And so I guess my question to you all would be like, what narratives are you hearing about food insecurity, healthy or unhealthy food, and sustainability in your communities? I can give an example again, because silence makes me feel a little awkward. In the movie Boys in the Hood, the father points out how there are more liquor stores than grocery stores in the neighborhood or in like urban centers, and how there's a drive to put poison in fence-line communities, neighborhoods, versus things that are going to nourish us. And so that's just what comes to mind immediately. And check.
Hello, Todd Cunningham from LA Can, based in Skid Row in downtown Los Angeles. One of the things that we see is just it's almost like the dismissal or dismissal of all the things we've learned about the way the healthy food, the importance of healthy food. It's like we've of course been the epicenter of the fight against homelessness. We're here in Skid Row. It is where there are more people who are the highest concentration of people who are homeless in America. And so we witnessed this firsthand and see many of us have lived through this. But what you find is like the food is not, of course, we know food insecurity and housing insecurity are inextricably linked, but there is zero talk of it. There's nobody who addresses it. And in fact, many of the 6 people who die a day who are homeless in LA County are dying because they're not getting the right nutrition. It's not just because of they're homeless. It's not just because they don't have a tent or that they're living on the sidewalk, but that just seems criminal to me and to many of us. It seems like that it should be a national priority that we link food insecurity and housing insecurity. Because when we look at the programs that are happening with people moving into hotels, getting vouchers, or they're in these congregate living situations where it's carceral living, they have to be up and out of there by 5:30 in the morning. It's just like in prison. There's the talk about food is just like, well, you should be grateful that we're giving you these meals. And it's like they're not fresh, they're stale, they're overcooked. Certainly no options for people's health conditions. If you were suffering, and of course, many of these people, of course, are suffering from, are prone to be having serious chronic health conditions. So the government becomes complicit in their sickness, and it's in our sickness at large. And so I think that that's something I would like to raise and to make sure that we are aware of. Thank you.
Thank you for that. I think that's a very valid point and would send me down a rabbit hole on like climate and housing security, but that's a conversation for another day. But they are all tied together, sadly. Anybody else?
I know I'm talking a lot, but I have a narrative that's coming to mind, and I'm curious if this resonates with other people. But I feel like there's a narrative in the world that whole foods, raw foods, healthy foods are for like rich people and white people, and that's perpetuated by places that like make this type of food feel like a status symbol or expensive and inaccessible. And that clearly doesn't make any sense, because we should all be able to access whole food, raw food, healthy food. And our system has just designed the entire food economy in such a way that that is more expensive than really complicated processed foods. And that's both a story and also the economic situation we've created that is damaging.
That reminds me of, yeah, I live on TikTok. But there's like a fight between like nutritionists, because white nutritionists are arguing that salsa is not food and it's not vegetables, although it is made exclusively from vegetables, and like the shame around cultural foods being unhealthy because they don't fit into an idea of model of what healthy foods are supposed to look like. And those narratives also drive what type of foods are delivered to like grocery stores and supermarkets in fence-line communities, because they're saying like our natural foods, the things that we eat, although communities of color, people of color are actually not responsible for the amount of meat that's eaten globally. We actually eat the least amount of meat, and we tend to have very vegetable-driven diets. Yet we are being told that our cultural foods are unhealthy. So a little frustrating over here. But on the flip side, what are some narratives you would like to see around food? Personally, I would like to see more people to get back into foraging, because it's just such an easier, once you have the knowledge, it's an easy way to really like nourish your body, and not just through like, hey, I'm hungry, I'm eating, but like medicinal practices are passed down. And I just think overall the knowledge of how plants work is like super beneficial for people. But I'm curious to hear what type of stories and narratives other people would like to see.
I would like to see where you get vegan food that in no way has 600 milligrams of salt.
The sodium is so high in like processed packaged plant-based foods, and like everyone's looking for a meat alternative instead of like really learning how to cook with fruits and vegetables and grains and actually season them, because I think that's also why people think it doesn't taste that good. All right, so guess we can move along from here. Emma, what are the importance of state and local elections always, but especially in this year in 2024?
Yes, well, I think, it's obvious that elections are important for building political power because they determine who's in office making decisions about policy. So obviously important to get out and vote and make sure that we're able to elect people who represent us. But I think one other piece of the election story that's interesting to talk about is not just the outcome of elections, but also the campaign cycle and the process of someone running for office is an opportunity to build power and to advance a story or narrative about the world we're trying to build, and also to build relationships with people who will be in positions of power, and to organize people and bring people together towards a common goal. And so I think, we think of elections as just determining who's in office, which they definitely are, and that's an important way of impacting decisions that are made about the food system. But there's a lot of other ways to get involved in the electoral cycle or other campaigns to help us build power along the way. So for example, if you get involved in a local community organization in your neighborhood that supports a specific candidate, or if you volunteer on that candidate's campaigns, or even if you run for office yourself, then you and the groups you align with will have a personal relationship with someone who can prioritize the issues that you care about, and you'll have more of a direct line to be able to actually make sure that those priorities are prioritized in positions of power. So I think that's one thing that's important to think about. And I'd love to hear people's experiences with political campaigns. I'm sure there's a whole range of them, from good to bad. One of the approaches we take here at Climate Cabinet is just trying to provide a resource to candidates. We know that, especially at the state and local level, candidates running for office are just regular, everyday people like all of us who decide to step up and put their name out there. And you kind of think that, like, when you decide to run for office, you sign your name on some piece of paper and someone will give you then a checklist of all the things you need to do and all the things you need to know in order to be successful. And actually, that's just not true at all. People sign up to run for office and then they just figure it out. And so if you can be a resource to people running for office, telling them about what you want to see in your community, helping them paint the vision for the community we can build together and the food systems we can build together, that's actually really helpful for the candidates, because then they have more stories to talk about on the campaign trail and can talk about that shared vision that community members want to see. And so in addition to all the work you can do knocking on doors to get out votes, making phone calls to get out votes, you can also, I think, the campaign cycle is an opportunity to shape the narrative that we're trying to build in the world, to put policy ideas out there, and also to get a candidate talking about it. And they're going door to door, talking to hundreds or thousands of voters across the area, possibly spreading your message and amplifying that narrative. So At Climate Cabinet, we like to see candidates as a megaphone for the values that we hope to be perpetuating in the world, and also as an opportunity to build relationships with people in positions of power. And so elections are an important way of getting involved. And that's always true. 2024 is, of course, a huge election year at the federal level, at the state level, and at the local level. We think about November as election day. But shout out to everyone here in Chicago. There's actually a really important election on March 19th related, and there's a ballot measure. Ballot measure 1 on the ballot is related to housing access. There's a one-time real estate sales tax that would increase funding for affordable housing and work to end homelessness. And of course, food access and housing access go hand in hand. So that's just one example of how there's always elections at various times of year, and this spring election is really important in Chicago. So that's a little bit about how we can use elections to build political power for climate and food justice. I'm curious to hear from folks here how you use elections to build power for your community and your priorities, if you have any stories or examples or questions about that. And I'm going to unmute because of hammering in the background. I also love the plug for Bring Chicago Home in the chat. If you've never gotten involved on the campaign trail or in elections, this is a great way to try out the experience of knocking on doors, talking to voters. I know a lot of the groups that are organizing around this campaign in Chicago are just like doing incredible work organizing across a lot of issues. Some of them doing food justice work too. So it could be a good way to get plugged in with the local community group, because together we're more powerful than we are individually. So I think the best way is to be part of an organization that is able to help make this type of work less daunting and make it part of a communal effort. So very exciting. Markia, do you have other thoughts on elections or election cycles, how we can make our voices heard in this way?
I echo like getting involved. I'm trying to think of like the name of like this organization I love. It's called EAT. And please don't quote me on this. So basically what they focus on is like getting support for the informal economy, because a lot of the informal economy has supported Chicago. They're also really big on community revitalization to be able to sustain and support people who are originally from these communities. And they overall just do like amazing work, especially since they do it across groups regardless of immigration status, because it's land and all migrants should have access to land, because migration is normal. Settling is normal, colonizing is not normal. But like through my work with them, I've been able to get more involved in like local elections and supporting people who have been here for generations, and I really enjoy that. And then also through Climate Cabinet, because Emma invites me to like everything and like helps me get involved in ways I wouldn't have imagined. Because since I do come from like a community here that has like changed throughout generations, our involvement looks very different. And I think like the trauma of being pushed out just hasn't given me the access to really be involved. So thank you, Emma. Yes, Eat Chicago. Yes.
What other groups are people involved in? Maybe drop in the chat if you're here with an organization that works on food policy, food justice. Drop it in the chat, represent. I'll pause for another minute, see if anything else comes to mind. Otherwise, we can talk about ways outside of elections to make your voice heard and build political power for issues that we care about, and making sure that everyone has access to healthy, affordable, abundant food. All right. So I'll talk a little bit about other ways of making your voice heard and building power. I think really though, I do love the focus on joining an organization or banding together with other people who are already working on these issues, because there are so many different things we can do out there. And it makes most sense to be doing this work in a way that's part of a broader strategy. There's like, it's great to plug in where you can, but one thing that's good about getting involved with people who are already doing this work is they've done some of the work to assess what are the power levers that we have, what are the most pressing issues, whether there's a deadline on getting a certain policy passed or an election. They can help get you up to speed on that information, which you could also, which you can just do the shortcut instead of figuring it all out yourself, because that can be daunting. So a couple of things you can do either with an organization or on your own is calling your representatives. Your elected officials represent you, and I think it's important to remember that. You can call them or write them an email or drop by their office anytime you want and tell them what's on your mind and tell them what you care about and that you see an issue in your community and you want to change it. You can organize phone banks, getting a group of friends together or an organization or a club that you're part of to all be calling into the elected official's office to ask them to make change on a certain policy issue or put something on their radar. Bringing our voices together in that collective way is even more powerful. You can organize phone banks to get out the vote on a certain issue, or just to call elected officials directly and raise awareness about a certain issue. We can circulate sign-on letters, showing how much broad support there is for topics that might not be getting enough discussion. Letters to the editor is a way that you can write like 1 to 200 word pieces and submit them to the newspaper to get your topic out there in the world. Apparently, letters to the editor in the op-ed opinion section of the newspaper is the most read by elected officials. Marquis is nodding. I'm like, someone told me this and I would believe it, but I don't have evidence. But it makes sense because people who are in office want to know what the public is saying, and so they can skim the opinion section to see what people care about. So that's an influential way of getting your opinions published. And it's pretty easy to get a letter to the editor published, at least especially in smaller newspapers. But usually you can just Google the name of the news outlet and there's a submission form for letters to the editor. And then op-eds are even longer form ways of doing that, which is a great way to build support for certain policy initiatives. And then, of course, joining a local organization. And then if you're part of an organization working in coalition with other groups, to be even more powerful together and show that there's broad, diverse support among various stakeholders aligning on all of the issues that we care about. Because again, we're stronger together than we are on our own. What are some other, and I guess, okay, those were a couple ways that you can make change outside of elections. I'm like already thinking of more ideas that I didn't have written down. Examples like making art, shaping the narrative, changing stories. What else do people have? What else comes to mind when you think about ways to build power and build political power for climate and food justice?
Hi, it's me who doesn't like silence in the room.
I'm right there with you.
Something that I've been thinking a lot about lately, we talked about housing earlier. I'm working on like insurance and housing and how that's like impacting affordable housing. And one of the risks that are coming up is that when that plummets, it takes away resources from communities because the taxes go down. And so like what I think a lot about, other than just like buying plots of land to be able to like community garden, is like, how do I invest in communities to where taxes can be used in fence line communities in equitable ways to help not just the rebuilding process, but to like further sustain communities. And so I say all that to say, of course, like town halls are great, showing up city council meetings, fundraising for, like there's a lot of money out there. Like philanthropies are trying to throw money at the wall and see what sticks. So like if you know anyone who can just like literally fundraise on behalf of an organization or a community, whether that's like small donations or like figuring out how to get in front of funders, all those things are always like super helpful. And it's kind of their fault anyway, so we might as well make them put their money to where they can help us rebuild.
You guys are a quiet group. Just thinking about all these big ideas. I think we've got 10 minutes left, and Markia, maybe if you want to do a quick recap of some of the things that we've talked about, key themes, and then we can open it up for any questions in the last 10 minutes. And if people don't have questions, we can just keep chatting. I'm sure we can find more things to talk about in the next 10 minutes. There's definitely an endless amount, but would love to hear what questions people have. But first, Markia, if you want to bring us home, that'd be great.
Gosh. Okay, so first things first, in the great words of Biggie Smalls. Food insecurity is a byproduct of enslavement and racism and colonization. We all should have access to food, and all of our food is, the goal of food is to like nourish our bodies and to give us energy. And there's no such thing as like bad foods. So it would be nice to get back to like reclaiming our generational knowledge and like our tribal roots of how we have viewed food and community. And also ways to get back there. Local elections, local and state elections, they have like the greatest impact on our day-to-day lives. They are also vastly underutilized, but at the same time, they are the ways that we make large impact. For example, one of the things I always reference is like the civil rights movement. A lot of times the way it's told is that it was like this huge national movement, and it was, but like it was rooted in local organizing and base building. The things that influenced national policy were things that really happened on the ground in cities and state policy. And I believe that one of the best ways to build political power and to build movement power is to make sure that you are working locally and statewide in order to like cut through the noise of like national elections and policy. And there are plenty of ways to get involved. If you are interested in building narrative power, you can go the route of like writing opinion pieces. Letters to the editors are always like really good ways to get your voices out there. Policymakers read op-eds and LTEs like crazy. It is the news that they are consuming. Usually the front-facing news are like, is for if you are trying to reach your community's audience. But if we're trying to push policy, we need to make sure that we write strong pieces that argue our points with realistic solutions. But also you can do door knocking. You can help organize call banks. You can volunteer in many organizations and with your elected officials. And then also, like, I think one thing that also gets lost in the sauce pretty often is that elected officials, like Emma said, they're people, and sometimes they need the assistance and the help to be able to understand the severity of problems and issues. And although they have more power within legislative sessions and like to make rules and pass laws that impact our day-to-day, they're still people at the end of the day. And I think that we go further with connection than we do with anything else. What am I missing, Emma? Dooch.
Great. You covered it. I do have to make a shameless plug for Climate Cabinet. If anyone here is interested in learning more about our work or supporting state and local candidates in key climate races nationwide, you can sign up for our newsletter on our website. I'll put it in the chat, and we're on all the different social medias, Instagram, Twitter /X, although trying to move away from that in favor of fill in the blank. LinkedIn. Send us an email. I'll put my email in the chat as well. I always love connecting with people here in Chicago and around the country that do this work and that are focused on building political power for these important issues, specifically in state and local governments. So reach out and
we do webinars.
Webinars.
So sign up for our newsletter so that way you can join in one, and then like if you have any requests, we can try to see if we can meet that.
If you are running for office or anyone you know is running for office or supporting any great climate candidates, we want to hear about them. We want to support them. So you can learn about that on our website too. And yeah, don't be afraid to reach out. Do people have questions in the last couple minutes?
Well, I would just like to make a comment. This was a really great workshop. You all did phenomenal in addressing the issues and engage in the chat. I'm always big on to see how the chat is engaged, and in that graphic, I still want to have a connection on the person that's doing that. If you can drop their information in the chat, that would be great too, because we can use that.
I agree about this graphic. I would love a copy. And Katya, thank you so much for illustrating this conversation, and to all of the interpreters as well. Thanks to
Thanks so
everybody for
much for
being here.
having me. Thank you.